the perpetual struggle against Count Dracula continues. Castlevania Advance Collection brings together 4 classic Castlevania games with deathly beautiful graphics and hauntingly epic music.
Well, that's convenient. Well, last time we visited the Castlevania series, it was with the 2001 Game Boy Advance launch title, Circle of the Moon. Honestly, I may have gone a little easy on it in that review because it was the first game in the series I ever bought and played to completion, but more than anything, what I hope you took away from that review was, even with its stiff controls, lack of a reliable source of healing items, and the game's fairly high difficulty, that underneath it all, there's still a game in there that's definitely worth checking out. With Castlevania cementing itself as a viable series for the Game Boy Advance with Circle of the Moon, Konami sought to expand on the success of both it and the search action subgenre as best they could. And what better way to do that than to bring in the man who helped popularize it himself, Koji Igarashi. It was with the sophomore GBA entry, 2002's Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance, that Igarashi-sensei was appointed by Konami to be the producer of the Castlevania series going forward. Not only that, but development was reverted back to Konami's Tokyo studio, who had handled Symphony of the Night, rather than their Kobe studio, who developed the previous game, Circle of the Moon. Now, as for myself, I didn't actually play this one when it originally came out in 2002. I was actually playing Circle of the Moon around that time, and by the time I had finished it and wanted to play this, it became harder to find for some reason. It wouldn't be until 2006 when both this and the next game in the series, Aria of Sorrow, got bundled together in the Castlevania Double Pack that I finally got a chance to play it. I received it as a birthday present that year, and that's when I finally got a chance to play both these games. And by then I had already played and finished Aria's sequel on the DS. The footage you're going to be seeing for this video is from the 2014 eShop release on the Nintendo Wii U. And with that, let's get into it. Harmony of Dissonance takes place in the year 1748, 50 years after Simon Belmont had vanquished the Curse of Dracula in Castlevania II's Best Ending, meaning that this game's story, chronologically, is set between the events of Castlevania II and Rondo of Blood. And since Castlevania II's Best Ending is considered the canon ending, Simon Belmont would live on, and House Belmont would be succeeded by Simon's grandson, Justy Belmont. But it's pronounced Juiced? Juiced. Yeah, apparently his name in French means just, or righteous. Okay. So anyway, 50 years have passed since Simon Belmont vanquished Dracula and scattered his remains to prevent him from being risen again. Juiced's best friend, Maxim... No, not that Maxim. Returns after spending 2 years on a training expedition, badly wounded and missing huge chunks of his memories. And with startling news. Their childhood friend, a girl named Lydia, has been kidnapped and is being held hostage in a mysterious castle that's randomly appeared out of thin air. Wasting no time, Juiced and Maxim head for the castle to rescue Lydia. Unbeknownst to them, they're about to stumble into something much larger. The game's plot starts off pretty basic, but since it ties pretty closely with one of the game's most prominent gimmicks, I'll touch on that part some more later in the video. One thing you're sure to notice right away when you start playing is just how much smoother and responsive the controls are. Gone is that stiffness and heaviness from the previous game, and in its place, a lighter, fluid, and more agile protagonist. This feels like a direct response to those who weren't a fan of how Circle of the Moon controlled, because this is a night and day difference. A new feature they implemented is the ability to dash using the GBA's shoulder buttons. The left shoulder button makes you dash left, and the right shoulder button right. And that's no matter which way on the screen your character is facing, meaning you can do a backdash as well. And, as you might imagine, since it's faster than your default movement speed, it makes getting around Dracula's castle much quicker and easier. Not only that, but you can also attack enemies and quickly backdash away from them to avoid oncoming attacks, so as you might imagine, it's super useful. What's weird is that this is the only game where you can do that. The next game still has a backdash, but no forward dash, which was a bit of an odd exclusion if you ask me. You'd think a little convenient method of traversal like this would have been a permanent addition to this series going forward, but I guess not. As was the case with Circle of the Moon, your weapon of choice is the whip. Though since you're playing as an actual Belmont this time around, you'll be using the legendary Vampire Killer Whip in all its chain link glory. You're even given that old ability to flail it around by holding down the attack button. In addition to the Vampire Killer, the series' trademark sub-weapons are also back. But if, for whatever reason, playing with these sub-weapons as they are is too boring for you, Harmony of Dissonance introduces a new mechanic called Spell Fusion. Throughout the castle, there are elemental books scattered around. Activating these and using your sub-weapons will either enhance it, or give you a whole new ability based on whatever sub-weapon you're using. It's pretty similar to Rondo of Blood's Item Crash ability, or Circle of the Moon's dual system setup mechanic. There are 30 possible types of spell fusion combinations, so you're bound to find a few favorites here. Some of the possible combinations just do a disgusting amount of damage to enemies. More on that later. This being a Metroidvania, that standard formula of exploring the castle and using keys and special abilities that are earned later to explore new areas is very much present and accounted for. These new abilities are unlocked by finding relics, some of which are out in the open, and some of them guarded by bosses. These new abilities can range from a double jump, a high jump that's implemented by hitting a certain button combination, and the ability to slide underneath low platforms. Not sure why you can't slide naturally and need a whole relic to do that, but then again, you couldn't even run in Circle of the Moon without a relic, so who am I to judge? Along the way, you'll also find Dracula's 6 remains scattered around, and these give you permanent stat boosts and permanent resistances to things like poison or curse attacks. It's definitely worth it just for that alone, but they also play into the game's plot. More on that later. And also, just like previous games, you'll be able to find permanent HP and heart counter increases. So not only is this game a lot easier to control, the truth is, I found that this is just a much easier game overall than Circle of the Moon. One of the biggest reasons why is the fact that this game has an actual merchant this time around, thank God. You can actually buy not only healing items, but armor and accessories as well. You can't sell any extras, you can only sell gemstones you find inside the castle, but money's generally not too big of an issue to come across, especially if you have the Greed Amulet accessory equipped, which jacks up the amount of money you find and turns certain areas in the castle into great money farming spots. And as a result, you'll be able to drip feed yourself potions throughout the course of the game and end up with some of the higher tier armor and accessories pretty early on. Now granted, where the merchant appears in certain rooms is dependent on certain requirements you have to fulfill, like needing to be at an odd-numbered level or having a certain item in your inventory, but chances are you'll run into him anyway just by playing normally. And while I would have preferred the merchant stay in one reliable, easy-to-find place instead of being at the mercy of some incredibly specific conditions being met, I definitely still prefer this over no merchant at all, as was the case in Circle of the Moon. And even without the merchant, the placement of healing items is a lot more generous than it was before too. I had no issue keeping myself alive in the early areas before ever finding the merchant, thanks to the more generous item placement and the better controls. And hell, beating bosses this time around actually drops that little orb thing that fully heals you. Something that definitely would have helped in the last game. Now I'd like to take a moment or two to talk about the aesthetics. In my opinion, the 3 Castlevania games were always some of the best looking games on the GBA, and for as much as I praise the graphics and art direction of Circle of the Moon, I simply can't deny that Harmony is definitely a big improvement overall. Not only are the sprite sizes much larger, but the areas are much more detailed, and there's more fluid animations as well. More of the larger enemies have individually animated limbs, and hell, some of the visual effects present in the backgrounds are pretty damn stunning for a GBA game in 2002. Although I did run into one occasion of the frame rate slowing down because of there being a lot of action on screen, but it didn't last very long, and it only ever happened to me that one time, and I just figured it'd be worth mentioning anyway. As I keep mentioning, the game was originally released in 2002, a time right before GBAs with lit screens were widely available or even existed yet. So Konami made an extra effort to make the game's colors brighter and easier to see on the old dark GBA screens, as this was one of the largest complaints levied against Circle of the Moon. I actually got curious and decided to test my physical GBA copy and my old Glacier Blue Game Boy Advance, and comparing the two games, yeah, Harmony of Dissonance is definitely a lot easier on the eyes compared to Circle of the Moon. But now that we have larger lit screens and, hell, other versions of both games available to us, I absolutely do not recommend playing either game on an old school GBA. Those screens were insanely dark, and I cannot believe we actually put up with it back then. I first played this game on a DS though, so luckily I didn't have to suffer. Though for as much extra detail and for as many improvements that they put into the graphics, this sort of came at the cost of the quality of the game's music. Having a lower quality sounding soundtrack is something that Harmony of Dissonance has become sort of infamous for. Apparently the reason for the music sounding like something from an NES game is because of space limitations after all the improvements to the visuals were made. As a result, what we have here is more chiptune sounding music. That may sound like a major downgrade over Circle of the Moon, and in some ways it kinda is, but personally, I find the actual compositions themselves to be great. The game's music is a major divisive topic for fans of the series, but I find myself in the camp of people who love it. I still think there's a lot to like about the music here. Since we're on the topic of aesthetics, we're going to need to circle back over to the plot of the game, as this does tie in pretty closely to the aesthetics. As you progress through the castle, you may notice that Maxim occasionally acts a little strangely when you run into him. The reason for this is that when Maxim was in possession of Dracula's remains, a wicked spirit was born after he came in contact with them, and is now possessing him. The castle that you've been wandering through is a creation of both Maxim's will and the power of Dracula's remains made manifest, and that there are two layers to this castle to embody both spirits. So you're probably wondering, why did Maxim have Dracula's remains in the first place? Because he thought that if he resurrected Dracula before he rises naturally in another 50 years and then vanquished him himself, that he'd be seen as a legendary hero alongside the Belmonts. The two layers I mentioned ties into the gameplay, as similarly to Symphony of the Night, there are two castles to explore here. Though, unlike Symphony, it isn't just the same castle with the same aesthetics cheaply flipped upside down. Which is good because, to put it bluntly, I personally found that to be a really stupid design choice. The layouts in this Castle B are the same, yes, but the enemies are different and the stages themselves take on a more ephemeral and otherworldly design. Kinda similarly to how Konami's own Silent Hill series tackles its other world, but not as extreme. Some areas may take on a different approach to their progression, such as one area's Castle A version being more puzzle-focused, and its Castle B version having more enemies. And there will be times where you'll need to backtrack between both castles in order to advance the plot. If this sounds daunting, the game allows you to compare both castles' maps at the same time to see where you've been and haven't been, and which areas in what castle need to be explored further. Searching both castles is how you'll find all 6 of Dracula's remains, many of which are fairly easy to find, but one in particular is hidden in such a dumb way that you'll basically need a walkthrough to find it. Get it? walk through. In fact, the only real challenge of the game may come from trying to figure out where to go, or how to get the game's best ending if you don't already know. I mentioned this earlier in the video, but now I feel is a good time to really go into more detail of just how easy this game is. It may actually be a little too easy for some. Konami may have heard the complaints about how hard Circle of the Moon was and wanted the next game to be easier, but in doing so, I feel like they may have overcorrected themselves and made the game too easy as a result. You're given so many tools to fight enemies efficiently that they don't really stand a chance against you. Hell, even the bosses, which there are way more of this time around, don't even put up that much of a fight, especially if you rush them with the spell fusion abilities the game gives you, not to mention the easier access to healing items. At one point, I had 40 high potions in my inventory, and I didn't even come close to using all of them. Granted, when you get hit by enemies, there's no post-hit invincibility like there was in the last game, so it can get kind of annoying when enemies combo you, but again, it's hardly an issue to recover from it. I only got a game over one time in the playthrough for this video, and it was only because I wasn't paying attention during a boss fight. After that, I got through the rest of the game with no issue. Heck, even the game's last boss was a pushover with the right spell fusion setup. I used the Crucifix and Windbook setup, and the enemies didn't just melt, they flat out disintegrated. I think I've droned on enough about how easy this game is. I think you get it by now. There is a hard mode you can unlock, but you only get it after you've already beaten the game. And you can always turn the spellbooks off and just use the sub-weapons like normal if you're looking for a little bit more of a challenge. Beating the game with any of the 3 endings unlocks a boss rush mode, where you can tackle the game's boss fights in a sequential order. And if you enter the Konami code at the Konami logo before selecting the boss rush mode, that unlocks... why ruin the surprise? In addition to that, beating the game once and starting a new game with the username Maxim unlocks a mode where you get to play as Maxim. He's faster than Juiced and has a triple jump, but he can't level up, use items or spells, equip armor or accessories, or use the merchant. You can only heal yourself either at save rooms or by entering a series of directions on the D-pad to use a move that uses up 50 hearts every time you use it. There's also no story-related content in this mode, so more than anything, it's just an extra little thing thrown in for the fun of it. And I think that's a word I would use to describe Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance. It's a fun game. Granted, it's so easy you can not only break the game, you could snap it in half, but it does still manage to do the Metroidvania search action gameplay so well that I can still easily recommend it. It's a very entry-level game, but I'm of the opinion that a game can be entry-level and still be enjoyable and worth playing if its gameplay is done well. It's beginner-friendly enough that I can recommend it as anyone's first Castlevania, but the next game after this one does even more with the formula, and is more of a challenge, that I may actually recommend that one first over this one. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The next time we revisit Castlevania, I'll tell you all about it.